Is it on? Hi, Alam. We're welcoming you. And I told you that Noah was coming, so. I'm not there anymore. Okay, so I prepared something little that you could use at your Seder in a lot of different places. So it's about matzah, so you could totally use it at yachats or at any time, okay? So the question I wanted to ask is, why do we eat matzah on Pesach? So on one level, it seems like a really stupid question, right? You all grew up with this from the time you're like 3. Why do you eat matzah on Pesach? Okay, because Bnei Israel ate matzah when they were slaves in Egypt. How do we know that? Does it say anywhere in Sefer Shemot that we ate matzah when we were slaves in Egypt?
Yes. They were running away, the bread didn't come.
Yeah, didn't have time to
Okay, so the truth is there's 2 different reasons that are given in the Haggadah, and they match what you both just said. So in the very beginning of Magid, we say, Halach ma'anya de'achalu avatanu ba'ar de-Mitzrayim. This is the lechem oni, this is the bread of affliction or the bread of poverty that our forefathers ate in Mitzrayim. So based on that line in the Haggadah, why are we eating matzah on Pesach? Because when we were slaves, we ate matzah. Okay? Now again, that's not totally explicit in Tanakh itself, though matzah is called lechem oni in the Torah. It doesn't necessarily say anywhere, and that's what you ate while you were slaves because you couldn't afford anything else. Okay? That's one idea.
So where'd they get halach manya from?
So halach manya, as the truth is, I don't know how, it's Aramaic, so it dates probably, to the Babylonian period. It comes from the concept that we ate, that it says lechem oni, but again, it doesn't say specifically that we ate it like as food while we were slaves. Okay? So that's one idea that's out there. The other idea is what Shuir said. Right? It says in the Haggadah, later on in the Haggadah, Matzah zu shanu achlim al shuma. Why do we eat this matzah? Al shum shelo hispik b'tzikam shel avotenu lahachamitz ad shenigla alehem melech malachim hakadosh baruch hu. Because when we were leaving Egypt, we didn't have enough time for our dough to rise until it was time to go, and Hashem redeemed us. Okay? That's probably the more famous reason, I think, if anything. Right? We didn't have time to make bread, so we made matzah, and because of that, we don't eat chametz, we only eat matzah. Okay? What's interesting when you look at those 2 sources, how do they relate to each other? If you're going to pick the first one, what does matzah symbolize? Slavery. And if you look at the second one, freedom or redemption. Okay? So it's interesting that Chazal used the very same exact object and have it have totally opposite interpretations. Okay? What I want to do now, though, is to actually question the second interpretation. Most of us were raised saying, we eat matzah because Bnei Israel, when they were running away, didn't have time for their dough to rise, they had to eat matzah. There's a big problem with that interpretation, okay? So look at the source that comes on the right side there in the box, okay? In Shemot Perek Bet, in what we're about to read this Shabbos for Parshat HaChodesh, it says, Shiv'at yamim matzot tochelu, Hashem commands Moshe to tell Bnei Israel, 7 days you should eat matzah, Ach bayom harishon tashbitu suor mibatechem. On the first day, you should make sure you don't have any leavened food in your houses. Ki kol ochel chametz v'nechatah hanefesh shehim Yisrael. Anyone who eats chametz will get curry. Okay? When does Hashem give that command? Okay, the beginning of Perek Bet. If you look in Perek Bet, pasuk lamed tet, that's the pasuk that tells us that they didn't have time for their bread to rise. Which pasuk came first? Okay, so look, I have 2 pasukim next to each other, right? On Perek Bet, pasuk tet vav, Hashem commands Moshe, tell Bnei Israel that they're going to have to eat matzah for 7 days. Then we're told in Perek Bet, pasuk lamed tet, when Bnei Israel were running away from Mitzrayim, they didn't have time for their bread to rise, and thus they ate matzah. Okay?
Maybe it's a
but
foreshadowing.
Okay, so what's interesting is that the command to eat matzah actually precedes the historical fact of them not having their bread be able to rise. If so, what's the real reason that Bnei Israel ate matzah when they're leaving? Hashem commanded them. Okay, so I think this is an important question. It comes out from a simple reading of the Psukim that whether or not we had a lot of time when we were leaving Egypt, we would have had to eat matzah. Why would we have had to eat matzah? Because Hashem commanded us. Okay, so you have this funny idea then. I don't know, like, what's the relationship? Because apparently, no matter what, we would have had to eat matzah. Okay? And of course that just raises another question, but if so, why did Hashem command us to eat matzah if it's not because of the historical reason? Okay? So here, we're not going to read this all inside, but there's a machloka between Ibn Ezra and Ramban about the question. Okay? Ibn Ezra says, no. The real reason we eat matzah is the historical one. The the only reason we eat matzah today for 7 days is because historically they didn't have time for their bread to rise. And that pasuk where Hashem commands Moshe to tell that to Bnei Israel, Hashem commands it before we left, but when does Moshe relay it to Bnei Israel? Only afterwards. Okay. So again, according to even I'll read part of it inside. This Shivat Yamim Tam Matzot Tochelu Zicher Lachilatam B'Tzitzcham Mitzrayim. The real reason we eat 7 days is because we're remembering how when we left Egypt, we didn't have time for the matzahs to rise. Hashem had only commanded them before leaving to eat matzah with the Seder, meaning with Leil HaPesach, with the Korban Pesach, but not for the whole week, right? He says the command that we get of that 7 days is only in commemoration of the historical fact. Since the historical fact didn't yet happen, in Egypt, how many days did Bnei Israel eat matzah for? Just that first night, and then when they didn't have time. Okay? But he said they really would have, had they had time, they would have been able to eat chametz that year. Okay? Hashem didn't yet relay this pasuk to them, even though Hashem told Moshe about it earlier.
So there was a possibility that we would have just had to do it.
Exactly. We would have just had to do it like our Seder. Exactly. Okay? So he's saying in the end it worked out that we didn't have time, and thus we now have to eat matzah. But that didn't mean anything to Bnei Israel at the time, so Hashem didn't command it to them. Okay? Ramban, on the other hand, says no. Hashem actually didn't just command Moshe. He actually relayed this to Bnei Israel before they left. If so, what's difficult for Ramban?
Why didn't they do it?
Okay. Well, they did. Okay. I mean, well,
The fact that it says that they don't have time.
Right. It sounds like the only reason that they ate matzah is because they didn't have time. Right. Yeah. The reason they should have been eating matzah is because Hashem commanded it. So he says, reread that pasuk. That pasuk is just telling you why Bnei Israel were forced to do it on the way. He says the emphasis on in that pasuk is not chametz versus matzah, but that they had to do it on the way because they didn't have time in Mitzrayim.
So why couldn't they do it later? What was the significance of making matzah the second they came out of Mitzrayim? What made them stop and just...
Okay, so he's saying they needed food. Right? The only reason, the pasuk tell you they needed to make food for the way. They didn't have time to make matzah even beforehand, so they made it on the way. But the pasuk's not emphasizing that they would have made chametz otherwise. They would have had matzah otherwise, but they would have been able to make it in the comfort of their own homes. Okay? So the question that we're now left with then is, according to Ramban though, why did Hashem command us to eat matzah? If it's not because of the historical reason, right, and regardless we were going to have to eat matzah, well then why in the world did Hashem command us to eat matzah? Like, what a funny command to have to do for 7 days, okay? For Ibn Ezra, we don't have to worry about the 7 days. The only question we have to ask is why in Leil HaSeder itself did we have to eat matzah? Because for him, regardless of the 7 days, at least one night we would have been eating matzah, okay? So for that, everyone flip to the next, to the other side. So, Avudraham asked a question. Yesh l'sh'al, we have to ask. He says, it seems that the reason that we eat matzah is not because we didn't have time for the dough to rise. Like we've been saying, because the command came prior to that. But the pasuk never gave a reason why Hashem said there's going to be this 7 day of eating of matzah. He says, therefore Rav Yosef Kimchi says, he says, when Hashem commanded us to eat matzah, it's because Hashem knew the future. He says, because Hashem, knowing the future, knew that there was going to be this speedy redemption, that they wouldn't have had time to make it, and therefore they would have been forced to eat matzah. Okay, so if you want to summarize Avudraham, what's he basically saying? Okay, to some extent. Okay. So the Avudraham is basically saying the command that Hashem gave them is because Hashem knew what the history was going to be. So it really is the historical reason, just that Hashem sort of preempted it by telling them about it already.
It's going to be matzah either way.
Okay.
He combines both answers.
Right. So he's basically, to some extent, right. He's basically saying that Hashem knew that the history was going to happen like that, and therefore He's able to command it even before it happened. Okay. Now, of course, would that make any sense to Bnei Israel in Mitzrayim? No. So on that level, that's a really bad answer, if you ask me, right? Because it's a command that's being totally meaningless to the people, because they don't even recognize the hastiness, because they were planning on eating matzah anyway. So it sort of loses the whole okay. So Ramban gives a slightly different answer. He says, "Hizkir b'matzah shetia lechem oni." In Devarim, when the matzah is described, it's described as lechem oni. And that's to remember that we were in Egypt without a lot of food and without a lot of water. What I gave you on the other side there, the Archot Chaim, we're not going to look at inside, he just points out that there's actually a story about Avraham Ibn Ezra when he was in prison at one place, and he talks about how he was fed matzah. And he explains that why was he fed matzah as opposed to like bread? Because matzah satiates you for a longer time, so you don't have to give people as much. Okay, so it's this interesting insight into why would you be eating lechem oni. So on one hand we say, oh, they were slaves, they couldn't afford to have rich bread, because the truth is, right, if you have just bread and water, it's all, just flour and water, it's a lot cheaper than flour, water, and eggs and whatever. Okay. On the other hand, he's saying, even from the perspective of the slave master who might be feeding you, why might he feed you matzah? Because he doesn't have to give you as much. Like, as everyone's probably experienced that heavy feeling after you finish eating matzah, right? It sits in you for a long time. I don't have to give you bread in addition, okay? The question that you have to ask about this, though, is, according to this, it sounds like the reason Hashem told us that we have to eat matzah for 7 days is because it reminds us of being slaves in Egypt. Okay, is that a good reason or a bad reason?
Good.
Okay, for today, it makes a lot of sense. Me, living in the 20th century, 21st century, sitting here and eating matzah, it reminds me of slavery. How about for Bnei Israel in Egypt who got that command?
Post-traumatic stress disorder.
Okay, so it's actually a really interesting question though. For the people who are living in Mitzrayim, they just lived through slavery. What do they need to have an extra week worth of eating matzah when Hashem's redeeming them, right? So it would make sense if Hashem had told us, in the future for 7 days eat matzah, remember that you were slaves. Why would you remind Bnei Israel of slavery in the minute of them being redeemed?
Because, like, we see that immediately after they leave, they're already sinning, so they need to remember that God's the one who took them out on time.
Okay, so it might be that, knowing Bnei Israel's nature, we know that these things don't live with them too long. They have to sort of live it as they're going out, even before they can forget it. One other thought that someone once suggested to me also is that perhaps it's dafka in the minute of redemption that you need to remember your past, right? You can't, it's very easy when things are starting to be good to forget how things were, but the only way that you can appreciate the good is to make sure you never forget the negative. And so even as they're going out, Hashem's sort of reminding them, make sure you remember you were avadim, we're going to live it as I take you out, okay? So that's one approach. Skip Ibn Kasbi for now, okay? Go to the Morning Bukham and the top of Kabbalah. So this is going to relate to what we did earlier about Pesach. So sorry for those that were in class. Okay. The Morning Bukham suggests that there's something else going on here. When Hashem commanded Bnei Israel to eat matzah, it was part of their tshuva process. Okay. So he doesn't say this explicitly, but it comes out from what he says. So the Rambam here is actually talking about korbanot in general, but we can again sort of take what he says and apply it to the matzah. It says, "Lefi shelo hayu avdei avodah zarah makrivim lachem ki im chametz umarbim bahakrat dvarim hamitukim umarchim korbanotayim b'dvash." He says, the way that Ovdei Avodah Zarah used to bring korbanot was that they would accompany every korban with chametz and with something sweet. It says, therefore, what's the halachot of a korban? What do we have to accompany our argument? You not have chametz, and what do you put on your not incense but salt. Wine also, but that's more relevant. Salt, okay? So he's saying to some extent, when we bring a korban, we're combating the way of the Avodah Zarah bring a korban.
But we do put
instead of dvash, we put salt. Instead of having, no, we don't have chametz in our korban. The only one is the lechem mishnah. Solet is in chametz.
Oh.
Right? Okay. So the only ones that we have is the shnei halacham on Shavuos is but the rest of them don't have it. So even though he doesn't say, of course you can then apply that to what we did with our Korban Pesach. What did we do? We have Korban Pesach with maror and with matzah. Okay? So the type of Kabbalah sort of extends that to the whole Korban Pesach. That basically what Bnei Israel were doing as they left Mitzrayim is showing how they no longer believe in the God of Egypt, which is that Seth, and we don't believe in the practices of Egypt, which is accompanying that Seth with chametz and with sweet things. And so the idea is that we take this symbol of our sort of combating avodah zarah and make it part of the holiday. Okay, so this for sure works for understanding, even as Ruth says that it was only that night, definitely. But even if you're going to explain why we ate in Egypt itself for a whole week, the idea is this is part of Bnei Yisrael's tshuva process. They're demonstrating we're going against avodah zarah. Anything that was a symbol of avodah zarah I don't want. Instead, I'm going to have matzah, and I'm going to remember how I'm going to Hashem now and away from avodah zarah. Okay. One last approach in our last minute. The Netziv takes a much more symbolic approach. Okay, so he says, what's the difference between chametz and matzah? Think about how chametz and matzah are made. So anyone ever bake bread here or bake matzah here? Well, you'll bake matzah later on. Okay, so the way that you bake bread, as you all know, right? You put your flour, you put your water, you put your yeast, you sit there, you knead it, eventually it's going to rise, etc. How do you make matzah? You just dump water and flour together and then you put it quickly into the oven. He says, that has a symbolic component, he says, what's the point of not eating chametz? So first he just tells us that in general we often have actions that have some type of a symbolic component that teaches us a certain message. He says, matzah in ba yitaron ayidei tachpulot yidei adam. He says, matzah is a total natural thing. There's almost no hand of man in the making of matzah. You stick two natural components together, and you don't do anything lahalot taiseh, you don't do anything to make the bread rise. Just kemach v'mayim shenivraim mimenu yivarach, straight ingredients from Hashem. Masha'ein kein chametz, he says that's not like chametz. Chametz sholit bam tachpulot ta'adam. He says chametz is full of man. Lahalot taiseh, or we had to go and stick that yeast and knead it, put all of our efforts in. That's what makes it rise. Mishum hachi hu oshikiyum Yisrael v'rak b'ruach Hashem. Says as a result, matzah symbolizes Bnei Yisrael's establishment via the Spirit of God. So to some extent, I'm going to take the Netziv and elaborate a little bit. What he's sort of suggesting, I think, that matzah to some extent represents humility. Chametz represents man's pride in his own doing. And the truth is, just looking at them, right? One's a bloated, full thing. One's this flat, small thing, right? So for sure, matzah could be humility. Chametz is pride. But he's saying it's even more than that. Matzah, you didn't do anything to make it. It's very obvious when you look at matzah. That could be straight from Hashem. That's Hashem's ingredients. It becomes matzah. Bread, on the other hand, was something that you put your effort into. It's very easy for you to just see Yad Adam, see the hands of man, and ignore Yad Hashem. And some people extend this to say that to some extent that's like sort of the difference between Egyptian civilization and Bnei Israel's civilization. First of all, someone suggested, I don't know if this is true, that actually the process of making yeast rise was established in Egypt. I thought that would be really interesting if that's true, but I don't know for sure that it is true. But for sure the Egyptians took pride in their civilization, right? They were able to make this massive, great civilization, buildings, pyramids, all types of modern technology for their time, right? And that's sort of what they stood for. They took pride in their army, etc. Part of the story of Pesach is to prove to them that it's not all about you. There's a God on top of you. And that's, to some extent, what matzah versus chametz is supposed to symbolize. Don't be full of pride and thinking about me, me, me. Be humble, recognize Yad Hashem in everything that happens. And that perhaps that was part of the symbolic message of eating matzah for a week. So in our last 30 seconds, I just wanted to bottom some of the reasons for matzah that get given out there. On one hand, it's a symbol of slavery. On the other hand, it's a symbol of redemption. And I think it's beautiful that Chazal are able to take the same object and make it both. And in some sense, that's that whole message of once you become free, part of your responsibility is to never forget that you were a slave. And part of that comes with the responsibility to have empathy for the other and make sure that everybody else isn't in a slave-like oppression or things like that. Another possibility is that it's freedom from avodah, and finally, chametz is pride and matzah as humility. So I think that matzah has a little bit more in it than meets the eye, and I wish you all a wonderful Pesach.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.